So I appreciate you guys coming out and spending some time with me. So as I said, we're going to chat a bit about Backbone. And before we do, I want to do a little bit of a history lesson because I'm convinced that for most developers, the world began with the first language they learned. and they don't realize that these ideas came from somewhere else. In fact, on a mailing list, I won't mention which one, somebody asked, basically, why does Java need this newfangled Lambda concept? Really? Lambdas are new? Wow, okay. I didn't realize that. But apparently, Lambdas are a new thing. But some of you may have noticed that there has been a bit of an evolution in the kinds of programs we've written over the last few years. And it started very quietly. There was a line here, a line there. But we've hit this inflection point now, guys, where I really hate to say it, but JavaScript's a first-class citizen. And this is no longer that ancillary language that you hope the intern will work on those tasks while you can go work on the serious stuff in the back end. So the challenge, though, for us guys is we need to get our heads wrapped around that new reality. And we have to figure out what does it mean to create applications that are in that style. Because you may have noticed the applications you're using today are different than the ones you used 4 or 5 years ago. Right? So that's really kind of what we're talking about, is how do we embrace these concepts. And by the way, there are a lot of implementations. We're talking about one of them, Backbone. To give you a sense of how rich this space is right now, I did a show in Sweden last year, and I was talking to this panel moderator beforehand. He's like, hey, we should do a panel on this. And I said, yeah, we should talk about JavaScript MVC frameworks. He says, great. Did you hear about, the XYZ framework? I said, no, I haven't heard of that. When did it come out? He said, this morning. That's the world we're in. I mean, probably this week, someone, probably out in the East Coast where they're not going anywhere because they got 30 inches of snow, has created a new JavaScript MVC framework. Nature of the beast. In fact, I just saw this morning on Twitter there's a new dynamic language on the JVM, like Golo or something like that. I hit Instapaper, so I'm not sure much about it. But apparently we've got yet another language running on the JVM. So, all right, let's talk a little bit how we got here. If you go back in time, you may remember this attributed quote. Right? That we're really not going to need that many computers. There's only going to be 4 or 5. Nobody can afford a computer. And that's attributed, but it's fun. It's cute. We're gonna assume he said it. And if you go back to that era, guy, these computers were huge. This whole building would have been a computer. You guys remember that line in Apollo 13? They're walking around, and someday we'll have a computer that fits in a room. Now everybody in this room right now has a computer in their pocket. That's crazy. Right? They were very expensive. They're all managed centrally. You had to get permission to go use it. And for those of you that can remember back to that era, there's a little more gray in your beard or your hair, might remember something that looks like this. I like the little cartoon, and that's very fashion forward. And the way we would interact with things like this could be as ugly as that. Right? Doesn't that look like fun? Imagine how joyful that was. One of my early managers, he and I were talking a bit about sort of this era because he went back quite a ways in software, and he said he was talking to someone at his cube, and this guy was literally looking through a stack of carts. And he said, hey, what are you doing? He didn't even look up. He said, I'm debugging. I mean, think about that era of programming. For some of you, you actually had to do it, right? So we go back there, and what did we have? What was our programming interface? It was something like this bad boy. That's a way to be super productive. If we were really lucky, we might have had something like this. Ooh, yeah, isn't that nice? I mean, it's like the screens and everything. Clearly, by your reactions, a few of you know what I'm talking about. This is fun. We could do all sorts of crazy stuff. Now, you take a step back and you look at that and you go, wow, how did we access the raw power of the mainframe? All this power we could tap into. Did we get a nice, pretty WYSIWYG environment? No. We had everyone's favorite interface, the green screen. Right? We all love these things, right? These things are great. And to a certain extent, there's some benefits here of the good old-fashioned dumb terminal. In fact, I did some tech support in college, and one of my least favorite jobs was we'd get some kind of a failure with one of the terminals, and then we'd have to lug another terminal all the way across campus, because inevitably when we'd get that call, the one cart we had would be used by one of our lead tech guys. And so we would always ask the first question, which is what? Is it plugged in? Yeah. So I got one of those calls from the library, like, oh, God, terminal's down in the stack. So okay, you just plug in? Oh, yeah, no, we totally checked that. So, I hoist one of those things up on my shoulders and walk all the way down there. Yeah, it wasn't plugged in. Oh, well. Now, by the way, if you've ever gotten on an airplane, if you've ever rented a car, guess what? You've interacted with a green screen. It's amazing to me how many systems still run in this environment. Now, it isn't all bad, right? There are some benefits to this approach. First of all, these terminals are free for all practical purposes, incredibly cheap, especially when you contrast it with, like a brand new Retina MacBook Pro, which is on my order list. Right? And they're incredibly easy to maintain. If one broke, guess what? You just grab another one, plug it in, and you're good to go. Everybody's up and running. There's none of this, oh, God, I got to install this, and I got to install that, and I got to go get this. We didn't have any compatibility issues to deal with. It all just worked. There was no DLLs to worry about. But, of course, it wasn't perfect. In fact, it was lacking some things, a lot of things, most of us would say, beyond just good taste. That's something that seems pretty obvious. Clicker's not working here. There we go. I accidentally hit the turn off button. Those UIs sucked. I'm just going to be blunt. These were not the kind of user interfaces that we would call user-friendly. Now, eventually, though, something happened. Computers started shrinking down in size. They were smaller than a room. In fact, some people started to get things like this. Who knows what that is?
Trash 80.
Trash 80. Here's a fun question. How much RAM did a Trash 80 ship with? 16. Wow, you guys are optimistic.
Couple large.
Try 4. Now, when this came out, what did people say about it? Is this going to revolutionize the world? Heck no, it's a toy. Nobody needs one of those toys. Which, of course, gets me to think, ironically, about Gandhi. Because what did he say? First they just ignore you, then they laugh at you, and eventually you win. It's pretty obvious which one won. Now, of course, part of the reason why they were dismissed as toys is they just weren't very powerful. But push comes to shove, guys, the future was here. We're starting to see this again right now. How many of you guys have some form of a tablet at home? Yeah. A couple of you have got them right here with you today. Mine's in my backpack. I will admit, when the iPad was first announced, I'm kind of like, okay, that sounds kind of cool. And then I touched one. I'm like, wow, how am I going to justify this to my wife? Of course, in this era, we started to create a new kind of application, didn't we? We started to create everyone's favorite app, the client-server app. And it was wonderful. We had things like VB, we had Power Builder, we had Access. This was amazing. We even had better UI. And, of course, as we are wont to do, we started taking advantage of all that power. We started to do more things with it. And we very quickly thereafter discovered, there are some downsides to this approach, too. This wasn't free. Okay, how many of you know what goes with this acronym? What usually goes at the end of DLL if you're a programmer? Hell. Right. No, God, it's no fun. I talked to a guy who did a lot of programming in this style in the 90s, and he said that there were times where you would literally just curl up under your desk in a fetal position. It was so painful to get this stuff to work. Right, so that wasn't a lot of fun. Getting this stuff out to customers was a real pain in the keister. We had compatibility issues up the beginning. Your app would install just fine. I'd install my app, and I'd break half of your stuff or vice versa. That's a lot of fun, especially in a big enterprise. It's enough to make you do this. Just scream at your poor. I think that's actually a ThinkPad, so that makes sense. Some of you have probably played in that arena, have the battle scars to prove it. But, of course, as is the norm in our line of work, things change. So in the 90s, all of a sudden, something new appeared. We discovered yet another brand new concept. This one was called the Internet. And we went, hey, wait a second here. We can build a new kind of application. We can build a really thin client that talks to a really powerful server in the back end. It's great. It's brand new. No one's ever done this before. Wait a minute. That does sound familiar. The ironic thing, guys, if you look at us on our webpage, we call it a submit button. Why? Because that's what it was called in the green screen. At the end of the day, they're forms with holes in it and a submit button, and that's it. The only thing we gained in the browser was images. And I guess we could, resize it. We weren't stuck in an 80 by 24, whatever that ridiculous restriction was in the green screen. Okay. But this was better. It had to be, because many of us spent a good chunk of our career rewriting green screen apps as web apps, so it has to be better. Otherwise, why would they pay for it? Why would they pay us? Now, for us, it was better because we didn't have client issues, did we? As long as it ran in the browser was our abstraction layer. Well, we did have one client issue, didn't we? Our good friend IE. We are so close to killing IE6. Well, I made that comment a couple of years ago, because if you notice, guys, IE6 pretty much is on the way out. I mean, if you're on any operating system other than XP, you're not on IE6. And so I mentioned this to a no-fluff crowd, and one of the guys says, not us. And I said, well, really, you just told me you guys are moving to Windows 7. He said, yeah, no, we got Microsoft to give a special build that includes IE6. Oh. Wow. You poor bastard. I mean, if that's not enough to get you off IE6, going to a new operating system, nothing is. You are stuck on IE6 forever.
You could be on IE7, but the clients are still on IE6.
IE6 is the bane of my existence. I'm happy to just finally kick it to the curb. So this is a good thing, you know. But to be honest, guys, these UIs weren't great. We'd really gone backwards. And most customers noticed that, and they weren't very happy with it. I worked on this application for a bunch of years in the early part of the 2000s. I don't know, was it the aughts, the zeros, whatever you call that. And I would get dragged into a room by our business owner every couple of months, and he would beat me up over autocomplete. He'd sit there looking at me going, Nate, I'm spending millions of dollars on this fancy new web app you're telling me I got to have. I don't have autocomplete. Seriously, I've Quicken at home. Quicken cost me $62. It's got autocomplete. Why can't you give me autocomplete? Man, did I have a lot of fun there. All right. So again, we got these forms, we got holes, we got this standard request, response, paradigm, and unfortunately for us, a lot of our customers had seen that richer possibility, and we took that away from them. Because it was good for us. It was a lot easier for us, because we could control the class path on the server. There was fewer of those. We didn't have to deal with all those nasty installation issues. But, of course, nothing stays the same in software. I mean, that's true about life. You're either changing or you're dead. There's really no in-between. So what happened? Anybody remember when this thing came online? Yeah, wasn't that a game changer? So I remember growing up, I thought that my dad was pretty bright because we'd drive anywhere and he'd know how to get there. And I remember being about 10 and kind of having this little moment of panic going, God, I'm going to be driving in a couple of years. How am I going to know how to get from point A to point B? You know, my dad has clearly memorized every road in the United States. And then one day we're going on a road trip, and I noticed that he pulled an atlas out from under the chair, and he was slumming through it, and I thought, oh, okay, there's the trick. A little bit of my dad's sort of, omniscience died that day. My son has no illusion that I'm all-knowing when it comes to driving because I have a GPS. My GPS tells me where to go. And the kid will point this out to me. I picked him up at daycare once, and I had the GPS. I can't remember why, and I had punched in the route to home. He's like, Daddy, why is the car telling you how to drive home? I don't know, because why not? It's there. Now, for me, this kind of stuff was awesome, though, because you could drag it and drop it. I thought MapQuest was really cool until I saw this. I went, wow, I don't have to do a complete refresh every time I want to change the zoom level? Well, of course, wow, how could you do it any other way? And I remember for the longest time until MapQuest finally baked that into their world, which took way longer than it should have. Anytime I run into a website that was using MapQuest, I'm like, are you trying to drive me away? Because seriously, this is how it's supposed to be. All right? Of course, the game changer for a lot of us, this was what sort of awakened me to the ideas of Ajax, was this bad boy right here. You guys remember Google suggests you start typing? Now, of course, we realized very quickly that this isn't fast enough. Now we have Google Instant. You start typing and you see search results.
Popcorn.
You realize the next step is you'll open Google and the search results will already be there. It's going to be tied in that Google Glass thing. Like, we noticed you had a compiler error. Would you like us to search Stack Overflow for you? Yes, I would. Thank you for asking. That's so great. So for us, guys, this was a big shift. This was the enter the era of RIA, Rich Internet Application. We're starting to kind of bridge this gap a bit. I like calling it the husky client because it's kind of in between. It's not too thick. It's not too thin. It's Goldilocks. Good thing. We've had a lot of fun playing with this for the last several years. A lot of us would argue this is the best of both worlds. Easy enough distribution, rich enough interface, again, kind of an in-between thing. But again, notice, guys, there's just this theme that seems to be running through the software we're writing. It's just this back and forth, this sort of pendulum motion of moving things from the client to the server and back again. And we're doing it one more time. Right? So we're starting to hit a zone now. We're pushing more stuff down to the client, but we mean a different thing when we say client. Now we're talking about the browser. The browser is the client we're shooting for. And these browsers are much more powerful than they used to be. And it wasn't that long ago that asking a browser to do any non-trivial JavaScript function, it's like, whoa, you're going to get that beautiful error message. This script is taking a really long time to run. Right? Now, with V8, Nitro, Jaeger Monkey, whatever they, how do you think they name these things? Jaeger Monkey in particular? That had to be a bar bet. It had to be. I love it. Although my son had this game growing up. It was you match the front and the back half of an animal together. And if you match the right ones, the front and the back of the horse, it says, you made a match. And if you do the wrong ones, it says, oh, you're silly, you made a horse cow. I'm guessing that's what they did here. They put a 5-year-old out with some things, like, hey, let's see what he puts together. Next thing you know. Now, of course, we're asking the clients to do a lot more than we did before. You guys are probably aware of this thing called HTML5. All sorts of new stuff is open to us. HTML5 lets us do offline stuff. HTML5 lets us find location, which is also a little creepy. And all sorts of fun stuff hiding in there if you haven't played in that space. All right? We get web workers, so now we can finally multi-thread our JavaScript, kind of multi-thread our JavaScript. We get web sockets, so we can talk to our server directly as opposed to constantly having to do the handshake every damn time. And we can actually make these things work without an internet connection. And you notice what sits behind a lot of this? Something that's gaining in popularity these days called REST. REST is one, by the way. That should be pretty obvious. I'm still having that fight internally. People still insist that, no, of course we need the whole WS Death Star stack. I don't know about that, but so be it. And, of course, it relies pretty heavily on JavaScript. As inconvenient as that fact may be, it is the fact. Right? Now, I'm going to admit, guys, it's a quirky damn language. There are bugs in that language. Guess what? There are bugs in Java. There are bugs in C#. There are things about any language you use for more than 5 minutes that you're going to hate. It's the nature of the beast. Fight it all you want. It's reality. Either embrace it or go back to the server, because this is how it's going to be. JavaScript runs everywhere, by the way. If you guys look at ClojureScript and you think, geez, why the heck did these guys decide to get a Clojure compiler that emits JavaScript instead of Java bytecode? It's because of the reach. JavaScript's everywhere. Like, I will bet you money your TV, if it's less than a couple years old, it's got a browser in it. Guarantee it. If your menuing system, odds are pretty good, that's a browser. A really, really crappy one, by the way. It will make you pine for IE6, but it's a browser nonetheless. It's running JavaScript. It's first-class citizen, guys, and we're writing a heck of a lot more of it than we used to. But this opens up some really new, interesting possibilities for us, and that's pretty darn cool. Right? That's really exciting for what we're trying to do. It gives us some interesting options. So for the first time in a long time, we can break out of this request-response paradigm. Now, some people refer to request-response as click and wait. I think that's fair in the way a lot of apps have been designed. But if you notice, more and more of the stuff you're interacting with on a daily basis, we're taking the same concepts we've been using in Ajax, these partial page refreshes and updates, and we are turning that knob to 11. All right, you're getting more and more of these single-page applications. And you know what? You're going to run into some that, boy, that really shouldn't be a single-page web app. Yep, absolutely. That doesn't invalidate this concept. All right, so we're starting to enter this era of what people refer to as the asynchronous UI. Why do we care about this? Why is this something that's starting to pop up? A huge part of it, guys, boils down to performance. All right, performance matters a lot to people. Right? Now, you can argue about whether we're really changing performance or simply changing the perception of performance. In reality, it doesn't much matter. Here's one of the interesting psychology tricks we can play with you on the UI side of the world. If I make you wait for 4 seconds, but I give you no indication that anything's happening, that 4 seconds feels shorter if I give you a progress bar. Even if that progress bar doesn't mean anything, which is clearly the case in the Windows file transfer thing. Ever seen that one? It's awesome. It's like, I'll be done in a minute. 2 hours. 60 seconds. Yeah, it's like all over the place. How does that work? Clearly that was written by an intern. Just pick a random number. In the web, milliseconds matter. They add up. And I'll admit, I always kind of thought there was a limit to human perception in terms of, boy, if we've got this thing responding within, let's say, half a second, you can't tell the difference between 300 milliseconds and 600 milliseconds, except you can. And that's scary to me. Right? So Amazon, if they add a mere 100 millisecond delay, they see sales drop by a full point. And if you've noticed their margins are razor thin, they lose money, and then they make $7 million in a quarter. on like 14 billion in sales. So that is a pretty big deal for them. You know, and it matters to us, probably not in this exact quantity, but people just leave. Right? Now, if Yahoo adds 400 milliseconds into their pages, they see a drop in traffic that's close to double digits. I didn't know they had enough traffic to even see that. That's what they say. Sorry, I don't mean to pick on Yahoo. If Google adds a half a second, now this to me is okay, I can understand people can sort of feel the difference in a half a second or not. That drops traffic by 20%. Isn't that mind-boggling? I mean, would you ever have guessed that? But that's what we're talking about here. This level of performance matters to people, even though it shouldn't be something you can even notice. Yeah, you can. It does matter. So again, guys, this whole concept just embraces what we're doing and what we've been doing really since probably 2006-ish or 2007, someone had zone depending. Part of what you're seeing in these frameworks is how do we get our heads wrapped around what can be thousands and thousands of lines of JavaScript? I mean, I remember the days when it was what? Main.js, and that was it. Not anymore. I mean, I worked on one application. We had 35,000 lines in our main.js, which we did eventually break into separate files to make maintenance less of a pain in the keister. But on a lot of applications today, 30,000 lines is just like a drop in the bucket. You know, some apps might have hundreds of thousands of lines of JavaScript. And to get your head around that, you know, takes a little more structure than we've had before. Now, I know what some of you are thinking because I've been there. Dear God, anything but JavaScript. Please, not JavaScript. Now, I just had this argument last weekend. People talk about languages. And it's like, oh, we got to use a safe language because, you know, I'm a pretty good developer, but a lot of the guys I work with are not very bright. So if we give them a sharp tool, they're going to hurt themselves. I'm going to channel the great Glenn Vandenberg, and I'm going to tell you this quote. It's my favorite quotes of all time. Bad developers will move heaven and earth to do the wrong thing. And so this notion that you're somehow protecting developers by giving them a safe language, it doesn't hold, guys. You've all seen crappy Java, crappy C#, you know, any of these so-called safe languages. You can write bad code in anything at all. Right? So again, I hate to say it, guys, you just got to embrace the fact that JavaScript's part of the deal these days. You know, or get yourself on the committee and see if you can sway it, but good luck. Right? So we're going to take these concepts, these partial refreshes, these JSON services, we're just going to turn everything up to 11. We're going to take these concepts we've used forever on the server, this MVC, model view control. By the way, if you start digging into this space, you'll see people argue about the C. Some people want to call it MVP. Some people want to call it MVVM. You know what? It's all the same. I prefer to call it MV star or MV whatever. It's the same basic concepts. It's just you're taking it from the server and you're plunking it down onto the client. And what we're trying to drive at is non-blocking UI. So we're trying to decouple those UI requests from that main thread so that the user can continue to interact with the application while we do something on their behalf in the background. Honestly, guys, it's no different than what you've been doing before, except maybe the order of operations. All right, so typically one of the changes you'd see in an MVC app, the user makes an update. From their point of view, the update has happened. We go talk to the server in the background. Whereas today, a lot of our rich internet applications, the user would say, I would like to make this change. We go back. Okay, you can make the change. All right, so it's just a slight change in order of operations, but same basic concepts. All right, so we're going to do a lot more rendering on the client. In fact, your server code might be very thin in terms of like what's in your sort of web page. It might really just be an include of a JavaScript file and just enough of a seed to say, okay, go get everything else you need. Right, that's kind of the ultimate goal, so to speak. All right, we're going to push a lot more state down to the client. We're going to let the client manage that. We're going to take advantage of some of these HTML5 features that we have at our disposal. We're going to use that as best we can. And we're going to talk to the server, but we're not going to do it and bother the user about it. We're going to do it while they're off doing something else. We'll do it asynchronously. Say, okay, yeah, we'll figure that out for you. All right, so part of the change here, guys, is we update the UI, then tell the server we updated the UI. Whereas today, mostly what we're doing is, hey, server, the user would like to update this. Is that okay? And then we come back and update it. And it's a subtle difference. But again, from the user's perspective, wow, this is much, much snappier than it was before. Now, that introduces some interesting issues, mind you. because the server can not be happy with the update. Right? So that is one of the problems we have to figure out, one of the things we've got to deal with. User might be trying to update multiple things at the same time. I know some of you are kind of going, wait a minute here. Problems can occur. Absolutely problems can occur. This is the nature of the beast. Usually the first question people start talking about is, well, how do I do my validation? Yep, you're going to have to do some client-side validation. And that's probably going to be some repeats, although some folks go to the extreme of using Node. And then look, now everything's in JavaScript. Now, personally, I'm of the opinion that the one language to rule them all concept is just dead and buried. Right? We never had that, by the way. I've worked with a lot of Java folks over the years who's like, oh, Java's the answer to everything. Really? How much XML do you have in your application? Oh, well, that's not, it's a language. How about HTML? Well, that's different. No, it's a language. How about JavaScript? You can go on and on and on. Okay, we've had 4 or 5 or 6 languages since the beginning of time. Right? So what's the big deal if I want to add 1 or 2 more? Anyway. Now, the server could certainly reject the change. Absolutely. You've got to bake that in. You've got to have a way of saying, sorry about that. Turns out that update's not legit. You got to do that today. You're going to push more stuff to the client. That's okay. Now, I shouldn't have to tell anyone in a room like this that you still need to validate that on the server. I have had this argument many times, sadly. I got into an argument with one guy once about that exact topic. I said, well, what? I said, you need to validate this. He said, no, I don't. I said, why not? I said, because you've got it in drop-down on the UI. It has to be a valid value. I said, what if I change the UI? Well, I'll just go through the application and change every. Really? You're going to find every spot? Okay, sure. I don't know how I lost that one. Now, the server could puke. Sure. Your server could puke today. It probably does. You're going to have to handle the errors. Nature of the beast. What happens if you and I both update the same record? It can happen. It can happen today. Right? Now, in terms of Ajax, I might have 3 or 4 requests going at the same time. Okay, we got to pipeline them then. That's all right. If you've ever used Gmail and you've tried to navigate away from Gmail or close the tab while Gmail is trying to do something, guess what Gmail said? Stop. I'm doing something. Okay? It's not impossible. Now, unfortunately, they can't stop me. I can say I don't care. All right? That's the nature of the beast. Your users can do that to you today, by the way. Up, close, go away. All right, so this isn't perfect. That's one thing I always like caution people on. I do a lot of I talk a lot about, how do we introduce change in organizations. This is a tough thing to do. And one of the things that we are tempted to do when we try to bring in a new technology is, it solves every problem you've ever had. And of course it doesn't. I mean, that's just ludicrous. Anybody who's done this for 5 minutes realizes every technology has benefits and it has negative things, consequences, whatever you want to call that. Ignoring the downsides of a technology don't help you make your case. In fact, my standpoint, you bring me something and you won't talk about the negatives, that's a sign you're trying to lie to me. I don't like that. Now, there are answers to a lot of these things, though. People have started to play with this. This is not, this is not a point one kind of a thing. This has been around long enough now that people have started to figure out some of these problems. But as a technologist, you should be asking yourself, why do I care about this? Why should I spend any time trying to do this in my organization? Well, ultimately, guys, this is about our user experience. All right, the goal here is to make that experience better for our customers, because that is becoming a really big factor in whether people will or won't use your software. Excuse me. And I'm starting to see that show up, even in big enterprise where I work. That's a big deal. We're starting to have problems attracting and retaining talent, because we get these people out of college who have used, Google Docs and all this kind of stuff, and we throw in front of a green screen and they go, oh, hell no. And I don't blame them. I don't blame them in the least. The green screen is not a pleasant place to be. Now, all that said, guys, this is not a silver bullet. No technology is. You should be skeptical. You should ask tough questions of this. Backbone is not the only answer in this space. It is but one of many. Right? We could spend an hour and a half talking about just a fraction of the options here. And by the way, to give you a sense, if you guys remember when Ajax first came on the scene, we had no libraries, then there were 4, then there were 400, and then now I think it's fair to say we've settled in on a single-digit number of legitimate sort of contenders in that space. And we can have a great conversation about why one is better than the other. But push comes to shove, I think everybody's kind of settled in. A lot of folks love jQuery. There's some XJS folks. There's the battle lines have been drawn. We're still in the expansion phase on the JavaScript MVC framework. We'll contract at some point. People start going, we thought this thing was great, but it turns out it's not so wonderful. Really, you want to be using this other thing. And odds are, in a couple years, somebody will come out with the jQuery of MVC, and we'll all drop the thing we've been using for 2 years because this is so demonstrably better. But for now, again, the concepts are the important part of this in my mind. Right? So it isn't a silver bullet. Don't let anyone try to tell you that. Not every application should be a single-page web app. Not all of your applications should be that way. You probably have some things that need to be synchronous. That's okay. In fact, the very first time I used Ajax in anger on a production problem was synchronously. We had a validation that we tried. We actually did write it in JavaScript. It took forever to run. We got the wonderful, this will take too long. And obviously, that's not something I can put in production. So the very first time we used Ajax, it was a synchronous call. And I had some people get very upset. They say, well, you're not using Ajax. What are you talking about? It's asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Well, I'm not even using XML, so what are you going to call it now? Jaj? I mean, if that's what you want me to call it, I'll call it that. But come on, it's a technique. So at the end of the day, we're going to sometimes need to tell the user, hey, I actually did refresh something bigger here. Maybe we do have to take it to a whole other page. And not everything is going to fit perfectly in this paradigm. Not every application is meant for this. But boy, there's a lot of places this makes sense. All right. My goal for you guys, though, is to just get another tool in your toolbox. This is something that in the back of your head, you might not have an application today that's a perfect fit for this. There might be one 6 months out, and you're like, oh, hey, you know what? That might work here. Let's explore. Right? So it's just another tool in your toolbox. All right, so how do we actually do this? All right, well, as you probably guessed, the server is going to be a little different than what we've done in the past. This is almost exclusively going to be REST. That's kind of, again, that is one for all practical purposes. I think that is a good thing. By the way, if you don't think anything powerful can be done there, just throw something in Sletton's way, and he'll set you straight on what can be done with REST. And you can do a really quick Google check just to see what's happening trend-wise there between WS and REST. But anyhow. So we're breaking out of the request-response paradigm. We're getting to much finer-grained requests than we've had before. There's trade-offs to this. Your server infrastructure may not be designed for this. Because in a perfect world, we probably have WebSockets, and so we'd have these connections open, as opposed to constantly coming back and asking, hey, can I talk to you? Can I talk to you? How about now? I know you totally forgot who I am. Here's all my information again. And by the way, that adds up. That takes time. WebSockets don't. Much faster. That's good. Right? So we may actually need to use a server that supports that, which, by the way, is most of them now. That list has grown quite a bit. I mean, even, I hate to even say this, but I think WebSphere can even do this. Not that any corporation actually has that installed, mind you, but in theory, it's possible. Right? Yeah, it's craziness. Now, the client is going to be a little different as well. The client's going to be responsible for both the state and the view, and we're probably going to push a little more down to the client in terms of data than we did before. Right? So it might be interacting with stuff it's got in its own storage mechanism, and we get a lot more of that in HTML5 than we had before. We don't have just cookies anymore. We got a lot of places we can stash stuff. We're almost always going to be making asynchronous calls. There will be cases we do full repaints. Right? Anytime someone says, oh, you'll never do that, you should be skeptical. Right? Be skeptical of anyone saying never or always. But again, the big shift here, guys, is we update the client, then we tell the server what the user did. As opposed to saying, server, may I? We say, server, I did this. You got a problem with it? See what happens. Right? So it's just a slight twist of how we've done that before. Now, I know what a few of you are thinking. It's like, boy, that sounds hard. I don't want to have to manage all that. That sounds like a lot of JavaScript to write. And absolutely, this can be more challenging. JavaScript, as most of you are aware, lacks certain features around structure. We don't have namespaces. We don't have, packages, nothing like that. All sorts of collisions happen. People forget to put the var keyword on a variable, and all of a sudden it gets promoted in the global space and causes havoc. Now, we've got ways around some of these problems that many of you are probably using day in and day out. You're probably going to want to choose a library in this space. Again, there are many. They're all built around this very familiar pattern, MVC, MVP, MVVM, MV whatever. Right? Now, again, there are so many in this space. I can't even keep track of a fraction of them. the biggies. Backbone certainly is one of them. Spine is very similar to Backbone, except it's written in CoffeeScript. That's the big difference typically there. You got SAMI, you got Knockout. Knockout gets a lot of attention these days, as does Ember. Right, so there's a lot of things in this space, and again, I can almost guarantee you there's probably been a new one that's created in the last week or two. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. Heck, one of you will probably write one just, for fun this weekend. Now, that does put us into a bit of a bind because we have the paradox of choice. By the way, if you've not read that book, highly recommend it. Very good stuff. Barry Schwartz, the author, went into the Gap to get a new pair of jeans, and he was completely overwhelmed at the choice. He's like, I just wanted a pair of jeans that's, this size and that size, and they're asking me all these questions about, the fit and the finish and all this kind of stuff. And he admits he got the most comfortable pair of jeans he's ever gotten, but he felt lousy. He's like, what if I would have tried on one more pair? Right? So we got kind of the same problem because, you could spend weeks doing proof of concepts on just a small fraction of the MVC library, so you've got to kind of make an educated guess. Ultimately, guys, you just got to play with this stuff. That's really the end of the day. Now, lucky for us, there's a really great comparison going on out there. All right, so on, of course, GitHub, where all good things seem to live these days, there is a collection of these, the same application, a to-do application, written in essentially every major player in the MVC space. And they've done a really good job. When it first started, it was very sort of ad hoc-ish, and Mary put up one, I put up one, and we'd use totally different structures, and so it made the comparison harder. Not impossible, but it was a little more like apples and pears. They've gone to great lengths now to say, no, you know what, follow the same structure so that people understand what's going on and use this CSF. So it's much easier to make comparisons. It's not trivial. I'm not trying to dismiss it to that, but it's much simpler than it used to be. There's also this really great blog piece written last year called The 7 Frameworks. And there was a conference where people got together and representatives from kind of the major 7 at the time and just sort of argued about, okay, what do we agree on? What don't we agree on? How are we similar? How are we different? And that piece does a great job sort of comparing and contrasting. Because there are some pretty significant differences, especially in how views get wired in. And that's one of the big differences with Knockout in particular. Knockout really likes to use the data dash attribute from HTML5. You don't have to do it that way, but that's how most people do. So, anyway. But I want to talk about Backbone. See, I knew eventually I would get to it. And here's the thing. Backbone's got a lot of stuff going for it. First of all, this is a very tiny library. Right? This is very lightweight. Compressed, it's about 5K. Right? So consider that for a lot of us, if you're using YUI or EXT or anything like that, 5K is like, are you kidding me? That's nothing. That's, most of the stuff is 30, 40, 50, 100. In fact, I worked on an application for a while where before we compressed it, I think the JavaScript was 1.5 meg or something like that. So there's a lot of stuff going on. It's pretty tiny. It's about 1,300 lines of code. And by the way, that's like the fully documented code. That's not like we stripped out all the white space and mashed it together kind of thing. That's the here developers, please read. So it's very tiny. Now, it will grow. I remember the days when Prototype.js was about that size, maybe 1,000 lines long, and there was like one website that would show you the APIs, and it was always one version old, and so I had to read the code anyway. Now, one caution here, guys. Backbone's not, out of the box, a UI framework. So if your need is fancy widgetness, you need a really impressive grid, or you need, the autocomplete calendar widget that does everything, Backbone isn't going to give you that natively. There is a project called BackGrid that is trying to give you a richer grid that you can use and tie into the Backbone ecosystem. I have not used it in Anger. I can't speak for or against it. But that's not the point of the MVC libraries. They're not here to give you UI goodness. They're here to make the JavaScript structure better, give you MVC concepts. All right, so if you need widgets, you got to look at the typical folks, the YUI, the jQuery, or jQuery UI, I should say, the EXTJS, things of that nature. That's where you're going to find your widgets. Now, it is possible to marry these and use Backbone with something like this. It gets harder. All right, so typically, if this is a situation where you need the widgets, you're probably better off using the MVC structure that comes with whatever widgeting library you choose to use. And by the way, they all have that now. All right, they've embraced this concept as well. EXTJS and the 4. whatever branch, they've got all this concept baked into it. Dojo's got that baked into it. I don't know anybody who uses Dojo, but it is there. I assume YUI 3 does as well. I can't say. I've not used that in many years, but it's becoming more prevalent even in the widget libraries, all right? So Backbone built to do MVC JavaScript applications. And as you might have guessed from that acronym, that means you're going to have what? Models, views, and collections of models. There's going to be some controllers as well. There's going to be some way of doing persistence. And of course, by persistence, we either mean into web storage or into the server using some kind of an asynchronous call. Rinse, repeat. Almost every MVC library out there is influenced in some way, shape, or form by Ruby on Rails. Right? And Backbone certainly fits into that category. That is not to say you must write a Ruby on Rails backend, but that is just to give you a sense of where this stuff is coming from and why it looks the way it does. Some of the opinions that are expressed in the code are going to look an awful lot like Rails. Okay, so if you think Rails is like, just a stain upon the earth, just bear that in mind when you start playing with this stuff. Again, data is going to live in models. This should look very familiar to anyone who has written anything in Java or C#. It's going to have some kind of a model concept with your data, as opposed to what you have today, which is what? Data just slammed all around the DOM. And what do we do, even with our good friend jQuery? We go find it and then manipulate it. Rinse, repeat. What we're saying here is no. Put that code together where it belongs. And there might even be some functions that work on that data. Right. Now, the big difference here, guys, is when that model changes, that's going to trigger an event. I changed. Whoever's interested in the fact that I changed, guess what? I changed. Here's my new values. Here's my old values. Do whatever you want with it. I don't know who's interested in me. Right. So publish, subscribe comes into this game. Views are almost always going to be tied in directly to that. Say, oh, you changed. I need to do something different. I need to re-render myself. I need to go take some partial bit of HTML, take a JSON representation of this model, mush them together, and update my section of the DOM, all right, whatever that happens to be. All right, so it'll update, do what it is. Now, again, we've been doing this, but typically today, oh, something changed. All right, I got to go find it in the DOM. I got to manipulate it. Then I got to say update, whatever. And so it's a little different, just, again, in the order of operations. You're still going to code to events. That part doesn't change. And the code actually looks fairly similar to what you've probably seen already. Now, in terms of structure, this is what the to-do app looks like, and we can argue about whether this is the best way to do it or not, but what they're driving at is you're going to have some basic separation in your JavaScript. There's going to be kind of this top-level app view. There's going to be something that sort of combines with collections. There's going to be that usually named after the model, except it's plural. You're going to have a collection of models. In this case, it happens to be a to-do item. The router, that's where we start getting into make the URL change, even though we didn't actually go anywhere. Update the history stack so that users can use their back and forward button and make the URL make sense so that somebody could actually type in a URL and get to this state, or they could bookmark. How crazy is that? And then you're going to have some set of views that are going to interact with those models. Right? It doesn't have to be structured this way. In fact, you could do it all in one file if you wanted, but boy, does that get hard to maintain. All right, now, I'm not in a position to argue whether this is like the best way to do it, but this is how you're going to see the to-do apps laid out, for better or worse. All right. So if you play around there, that's what you're going to see. Now, in terms of what it actually looks like when you interact with it, ooh, isn't that pretty? You go ahead and you start typing stuff in, you hit enter, bam, there it appears on the page. Rinse, repeat. Okay, this is a model. Isn't that pretty? All right. So what do we got going on in our model here? Well, one of the things you'll notice right away is we're going to extend something. So we are going to get some stuff for free from the fact that we are extending from Backbone model. That's kind of handy. We're going to get things like save. We're going to get ways of retrieving and setting attributes. We're going to get an empty validate method, things of that nature. I get to set some defaults. So when you create a new instance of a to-do, if you don't give me a value for done, it's false. If you don't give me a value for order, I'm just going to use to-do's next order, please. And then you're going to get some set of functions. In this case, we're just going to update. That's all we're doing there. So this.save, save is one of those magic methods we get from extending Backbone. All right. Now, we're going to have a collection of these items, and not surprisingly, that's going to extend from our good friend Backbone.collection. So again, we get some stuff for free. Isn't that nice? In this case, we're going to have to-dos as our model. Now, don't get too excited. That doesn't actually mean anything. I mean, you can put whatever you want in there because it's JavaScript. It's not like doing any type checking for you. This is just says, I expect to see models here, okay, that are of type to do. So don't be giving me circles. You define the storage mechanism. In this case, I'm actually just going to use local storage. I'm going to say, all right, browser, go ahead and just store it yourself. There's a nice little proxy on top of that, so I don't have to deal with the fact that the browser doesn't know how to do that. It does that for me. More likely, in the real world, this is going to be an AJAX call back to your server. Right, that's pretty typical. And then we're going to have some set of functions. In this case, we're leveraging a library, the one library the backbone depends on, which is called underscore. And by the way, even if you think this whole MVC thing is just a total bunch of hooey and why would you ever want to do that in JavaScript, I can totally respect that. You owe it to yourself to spend a few minutes looking at underscore. All right, and there is, and I'm blanking out, there's a drop-in replacement for underscore that at least allegedly has better performance. And if you poke around in the to-do site, you'll find that pretty quickly, but I'm blanking on the name of it. Underscore is a JavaScript utility belt. And it gives you a lot of interesting little functions for doing some functional programming stuff, bringing that concept into JavaScript. Some people argue that's a better way to write programming, period. Another nice sucks rock kind of argument we can get into. A lot of interesting stuff there. So this is actually taking advantage of one of those functions, and that's filter. So what we're saying here is, hey, collection, I want back a different collection. I want everything you got. I only want the things that match this. So give me a filtered list where the things are done. I bet everybody could very quickly write the opposite method. Give me the things that are not done. There's actually a couple ways you can do that. But very, very powerful thing. Again, underscore, you don't have to believe in any of this MVC stuff to take advantage of that. This is the view part, and the most interesting aspect to me here is this block right here. This is your event block. Now, a lot of you, I can just guess, are using jQuery right now. And if I went up to your application and I picked some random interesting element, and I said, hey, how many events are tied into this element? Could you tell me? Could you confidently describe every single event that's tied to that element? I mean, probably when you first coded it, you were very disciplined. All your events went in the same place. But then, you had to make that quick fix, at the end of the iteration, and so you jammed something in, and then the intern got a hold of it, and they put something somewhere else, and now you got event logic scattered all throughout your code. Lovely. So if you wanted to add an event here, where would you go? You needed to update an event, where would you go? Now, we can argue about the syntax, right? This is a tuple without in a language that doesn't have them, right? But read it left to right. What do you think is going on here? What's that first element? What does click probably mean? The click event, right? What am I doing the click event on? What do I care? When somebody clicks just anything random? No, I care when something has the check class applied to it. So when someone clicks on the check, do what? Toggle done, please. Toggle done is, of course, a callback to a function that I did not show you. Rinse, repeat. I love the fact my events are in one place and I can quickly find them. That, to me, is a win. And then, of course, you're going to have some set of functions. In this case, the initializer says, all right, what events do I care about? So what this view says is, hey, when the model changes, I want to know about that. Because when the model changes, I want to render myself. And if the model goes away, I want to know about that too. Because if the model goes away, you don't need me anymore. I'll go away myself. I'll just disappear. Poof, gone in a puff of smoke. Rinse, repeat. And then, of course, you're going to have a set of callback functions. So render here. Now, some of you, again, that know jQuery might recognize a good friend hiding in this code. Now, one thing I want to caution you on with some of these MVC libraries, some of them are less forthcoming about their dependencies than others. Now, you don't need to use jQuery to use Backbone, although you will often see jQuery and Backbone paired together. Now, bear in mind that one of the rationales to moving towards this style of programming is these libraries are much smaller. And for a lot of us, like, smaller, who cares? I write desktop applications. I've got a big fat pipe to every one of my customers because they all are in my building or they're on my network, they're on my backbone. You know where more of your customers are coming from these days, though? They're from these little devices that we all have in our pockets. And you may have noticed we don't always have 5 bars of LTE coverage. So now all of a sudden with these bad boys, size matters. And it's like, I want a smaller packet because if you're asking me to download the world, I might not be able to do that before I hit a dead zone. And you probably noticed some of the applications you use on your phone day in and day out handle a less strong connection better than others. I've got one in particular that, my God, if I don't have like 4 bars, this thing just doesn't know what to do. It's like, oh my God, I can't talk to my server. Like, really? Maybe you guys need to rewrite that. So, anyway. So a little bit of JavaScript mixed in there. And again, all that's doing is saying what? Go get my template, take my model as JSON, mush them together, which beats the pants off of trying to concatenate some strings together and hopefully you get it right, especially if you're trying to generate that from your server. There is an argument to be made today that your server should not be doing view, that your server's job should be data. You ask the server, hey, I need the account information. Here you go. That's all I know. I'm not going to tell you how to display it. I don't know who you are. You might be a TV. You might be a 3.5-inch phone. You might be a standard desktop application. But I, as a server, that's not my job. You're the client. You figure out how to best present this data that you asked for. That is a very powerful paradigm. Because I will tell you this much for a fact. Anyone who tries to sell you a unicorn of an app server that says, oh, look, I've got the mobile channel covered, they're lying to you. Right? You want to boil down the mobile thing? I don't care whether you think HTML5 is better than native, right? That's a fun argument to have. The only thing that really matters in terms of how you solve the mobile problem, guys, is did you rethink the experience? If you didn't take time to rethink the experience, you failed, period, full stop. I don't care if it's the most gorgeous native iOS app anyone's ever written or the fanciest pants HTML5 thing that's ever been created. If you just said, I just took exactly what they have on the desktop and boom, it's on the phone. No, sorry, wrong. Try again. The use cases on the phone are a little different than the use cases on the desktop. That's the part we need to spend our effort on. Right? The actual solutioning, okay, it's a fun argument, but it's not nearly as important as rethinking the experience. All right, now this is how this thing actually works in practice. Those of you on the phone aren't actually going to see the video. That won't play on my monitor, sorry. Notice it is updating instantly. Notice the part on the bottom, 2 items left, 3 items left. That pops up instantaneously. Now, this is obviously a very trivial application. You can see what kind of mood I was in when I wrote this. It was a Sunday, in case you couldn't figure that out. And in fairness, my wife was cleaning the vegetables, not me. So. But as we start doing that, look, instantly, 1 completed item, 3 items, 2 complete items. That's instantaneously updated. From the user's perspective, it's just working. As opposed to what we've done in the past. Well, let me go ask the server to make sure I can mark this completed. Let me go ask the server to make sure I can delete this. No, we'll deal with that in the end. And of course, yes, your server could GAC, but come on. That can happen today, too. Now, again, this does use jQuery. You don't have to use jQuery, but you will see plenty of jQuery mixed into this. Obviously, that increases your footprint. So if your goal is to have the smallest download possible, not with jQuery you won't. You know, we're getting closer to a world where jQuery has a builder where you can say, I only want these functions, and that's all you get, as opposed to, here's jQuery, here's everything. We're still a little ways away from having that, but that's certainly something that's on their radar, to have a way of configuring jQuery to be what you want. You know, there are a few projects out there right now trying to kind of poke jQuery in the side to get them to move faster. Zepto is one example of that. That's something that Thomas Fuchs wrote. Very interesting stuff. So, again, guys, not that hard. If you don't like the To-Do app, there is actually a wine seller app, which appeals to me because I like wine. So that's a good fit. So. All right, let's talk a little more about this. So the model concept. You're going to create models that, not surprisingly, extend Backbone Model. You're going to get some stuff for free, part of the deal. You're going to add whatever properties and methods you need to make this model make sense. So whatever, it's probably going to look an awful lot like your Java class that represents that object on your server. Not perfectly, of course, because a lot of times on the server we have this very complicated model, and then we flatten it when we hand it over to the client. So it may have considerably less fidelity. Right? We get a lot of stuff for free by doing that, so a bunch of stuff kind of comes along for the ride. As I mentioned, we get this get-set concept for updating and retrieving our values. We get the toJSON thing. You say, hey, model, give me yourself this JSON because I'm going to dump you into this partial template thing over here. We get the save and the validate. Validate's empty. You got to provide it because, of course, it doesn't know how to validate your model. But when you call save, when you call set, it's going to trigger the validate. You can figure out what changed. You can figure out what it used to be. Quite a bit more hiding in there. Again, validate's empty. Not too surprising. You got to implement that. So if somebody does give you bad data, it's going to stop. It's not going to allow that to propagate. So again, we are going to have to do some client-side validation. I know for some people, oh my God, we've repeated some code. Yeah, it's the nature of the beast. All right. To me, the most powerful aspect of this, guys, is if we really do get the view out of the server, now we have that reusability. We can reuse that service across a whole host of clients we never even dreamed of. But that, of course, means we got to have the business logic in the server. Right? So it is a little bit of a change from that. And that, by the way, that's a hard press. So many people have spent so many years building that to be so intertwined that the server knows exactly what the view is knows exactly what the server is, and boy, that pens you in on a lot of things. Right? So you get ways of getting and setting values. You saw collection as well, right? So collection is very powerful. This is where we get some really interesting magic for working with these sets of models. You're going to have multiple collections, multiple models, so it's going to allow you to get through that. Obviously, this is usually going to be a single type. Now, there's nothing that's going to prevent you from accidentally putting the wrong stuff in there, but it is there. There are, of course, events that fire on the collection itself. So you may have a view that cares about the collection, another view that cares about the specific item in the collection. It just depends on what you're trying to do. Not too surprising, when something gets added or removed, you're going to know about that. That's not just going to sneak in. I mentioned underscore as well. Good, I did put it in here. The drop-in replacement for underscore is low dash. Now, I don't have a dog in this fight. Some people are arguing that low dash gives you way better performance than underscore, and it's a drop-in replacement. Your mileage may vary, right? So you will see some folks use that instead of underscore. So as you guys saw before, we get some nice ways of iterating over collections. Some of this, we're still waiting to have this in Java, but we're getting there. So lambdas, finally, that brand new spanking concept lambda. Right? So we get ways of parsing and sorting and plucking things out and obviously adding and removing them and quite a bit more. Right? So you can always say, hey, I would like this specific model. Right, and usually there's a client and a server-side ID. So if you create a new instance on the client, it's got a client-generated ID. That probably isn't the kind of thing you're going to want to store as your, blanking on the term, on your database key, right? Collections can be ordered. You get a much better comparator inside of here than you do just in raw JavaScript, so that's kind of a win there. Fetch will actually go to the server and say, hey, give me the data. And by the way, that's expecting a URL endpoint that follows REST concepts from Rails, right? Now, you don't have to do it that way, but out of the box, that's what it wants to work with, is sort of that Rails sort of opinion on how these things should be named. All right, we saw the view before. The view is a little bit more of a convention than anything else. Some of the differences between some of these libraries does come down at the view level in terms of how much they enforce or not that. Templating is up to you. You can do whatever you want there. You'll see some people just use essentially like jQuery templates. Other people will use, handlebars or mustache. It doesn't really care what you use. I recommend you use something, though. All right, trying to, hand code HTML, really friggin' hard. I mean, I remember eons ago I did that on a web app, and it's so impossible to get it right. I mean, I remember, I built this thing to, add a row dynamically to a table. And I remember when, the first times I did it, I was getting nan. And when I was like, nan, not a... What the hell? How's this not? Oh yeah, I forgot a tick somewhere. It's just oh good Lord, it's just so painful. So please save yourself, some sanity and use your favorite templating library. All right, Vue, again, not surprisingly, is going to handle your presentation. You're going to link your view to some element on the DOM. All right, now which one? It's up to you. I don't know. I'm not going to tell you which one it is. And by the way, not surprisingly, we get a link to that. So Backbone has this concept, this.el. The element I represent. Now, you can bind to something that exists. You can use whatever selector you want for that. You can be as fancy or as not as you want. If you leave it off, which you're certainly welcome to do, you can say, okay, fine, I'm just going to use an empty div. That's pretty safe. Probably going to work. Okay. So as you guys saw before, guess what happens? We're going to render that anytime there's a change in the model. So if somebody updates the model, well, I better change my view then to update the fact that they changed the model. Now, that's all going to happen for you. Change event gets thrown. You've told it when the change event happens, call my render method. My render method knows how to render me. Now, contrast that with what we've been doing for the last several years, which is, I got to retrieve it, and then I got to futz with it. I got to figure out, hey, what was the jQuery method to change CSS again? And wait, can I give it a list of things? Or separate by commas? I can't remember. Well, just try it and see what happens. Okay. So you're going to extend that. You're going to implement render. Your render is going to do something really hard. Return the HTML necessary to render it. Rinse, repeat. And it's going to update whatever element you told it cares about. It's going to do that for you. Again, probably leveraging some kind of a templating library. Templates are your friend. I beg you to use them. Now, as you saw, the model says, well, here, I can give you myself as a JSON object. JSON for the win. By the way, don't return XML from your server, please, ever. Such a bad idea. XML is not fit for human consumption. You know, I have argued with people endlessly over that, but I think we have finally reached the point. In fact, I just saw Tom Mars did a rough card recently on JSON. And I saw a little snippet of an interview with him where he basically said, oh, yeah, no, I won't even touch XML anymore, basically. It's like, yes, thank you. Yes, finally. You'll also get that event hash as well. All right, so this makes it incredibly easy for you to bind to whatever interesting event might pop up that you care about. All right, we saw that template before. You got to give it the event you care about, the selector on that event, and then what do I do when that happens, when that meshes? You don't need the selector necessarily, depending on how you're doing this. So if you leave the selector off entirely, that's cool. It's just going to bind to EL. And by the way, those selectors are within the scope of the this.el. So you don't have to have the world's most complicated selectors. You've already sort of said, okay, I only care about this and below. All right, so that does simplify life quite a bit here. All right, quite a bit more on there. All right, so that's the overall concept, but let's push this one a little further. Let's take one of those existing applications and add a few more things onto it. You know, we throw in a priority button, and, you know, let's maybe say that we got some CSS about whether this is a high, a medium, or a low. So you want to do these kind of things incrementally. You don't want to just sort of jump right in. Okay, so you want to start by figuring out, all right, well, let's do the simplest thing first. Let's add a button. All right, so where would the button live? All right, not too hard. That's just going to be in your HTML somewhere. All right. Now, in this case, we are using kind of this script text template concept that some people are fond of. You certainly can use it whatever you want. That's up to you. But you will see this idea. Right. So if you run into this and you're like, wait, this doesn't look like JavaScript, you're right, it's not. It's this sort of pseudo templating concept. All right. So what do we got in there? Some buttons. Well, look at that. It's just good old-fashioned HTML, like your dad wrote. Now, probably not your dad. All right, let's get to the eyes. I'm trying to say we've been doing it forever. This is a data dash concept from HTML5. All right, so data dash, if you're not familiar with it, that's just an arbitrary bucket. You can put whatever you want. Data dash, anything, it's yours, and you still have valid markup if you care about validating your markup. All right. By the way, this is not the only way you could do that. This is just a very expedient way that I used for a workshop. So actually based on something a friend of mine had written. So, okay, now that's fine, but those buttons need to do something. Otherwise, they're not very interesting. So where would we go to change that? You know, again, we want to start very simply. Let's make sure that it's wired up. Do the simplest thing first before you dive off into the complicated stuff and go, oh my God, why isn't this working? Well, let's just do it step by step. Okay, so if we want to add an alert anytime someone clicks the button, we would go somewhere to do that. Okay, so where would we add that event handler, might you ask? Right? How do we add an event handler? Anybody want to guess where we go to do that? Oh, yeah, there's a view, right? And it's got this big events block. Right, so what would we do? We would come in here and, hey, look at that. Click dot priority, change priority. So what does that mean? When I click on something that has that priority class attached to it, by the way, if I wanted to do an ID selector, what would I change? Be a pound sign. Yep. And I'm going to call change priority, which in this case is going to be pretty dumb. Right? But that's what we're going to start with. Very straightforward. Now again, put yourself into the typical jQuery application. Do you have all your events in the same place? Maybe, probably not. All right? So we've got that, and then we have a function. We have a callback function. You guys have been doing this 3 years. There's no magic here. It just happens to be a function that we call when that happens on that button. So what do? We come in. We're actually going to grab that priority. That's what that data dash priority thing is. It's a little ugly. We're using a little bit of jQuery there. But now, when someone clicks on the button, we get an alert. Yes. Okay, so that's the next step. that's not very interesting. That's not very user-friendly, so that's not something we would want. We would probably want to go in and modify the CSS when someone makes that change. So where would we go to modify that? Anybody remember? You just saw it. That's the view. Anybody know an easy way to update CSS, perhaps using jQuery?
Add a class.
Yeah, there's an easy way to do that. So we go to that same view class again. We go to that same method, except now we're going to change it. It's going to do a little more than it did before. We're going to blow that up for you here. And I'm going to drop the alert part. We really delete that. We wouldn't comment it out. And instead, I'm going to play around with some of these jQuery methods. Rinse, repeat. I'm going to say, all right, I want to know what the priority is based on that. I'm going to get rid of that, and I'm going to go ahead and tell me what my priority was. And then I cleverly name the CSS the same as the priority. I'm very smart. All right? So now we've updated the CSS. That's great. But that's not enough, is it? I mean, the model probably needs to know that it has a CSS attribute or that it has this new priority attribute. Otherwise, it's not going to remember this for us. So we probably need to make some modifications there. Where do I go to modify a model? Is it in the view? No, it's in something called model. Shocking. So we come in here, and look what I did. I added a new attribute. My God, so complicated. Priority, I'm going to default it to low. You may provide a different default, depending on the kind of to-do system you're creating. All right, so there we go. We've come in. We've now added that as an attribute to the model. That's good. But we're not actually updating the model, are we? All we're doing is changing the view. But the model doesn't know that we made a change. So there's another step in here, isn't there? We've got to change that model's attribute. We need to also persist the fact that that model has changed so that we can send it up to the server or update whatever's in local storage, et cetera, et cetera. All right? So there are some methods that allow us to do that. You guys remember what they're called? There's something called set, something called save. What happens if I give those methods invalid data? They just go along happy as can be? No, they're going to stop if I did what? No, I wrote a validate method. The validate method is going to get triggered and say, well, you can't set this as a priority. There is no 1A. There's ones, there's twos, there's threes, whatever it happens to be. All right, so we come in once again. We're going to change that function one more time. Instead of just changing the CSS, we're going to start playing around with our model. We're going to say, hey, model, I want you to set this attribute, the priority attribute with the priority I just pulled off of the button that was clicked. What did you want me to do? Low, medium, high. And I'm going to update my model. So now my model has that data, and I'm going to say, okay, model, save yourself. Save yourself. Done. The pizza's gone. Almost done. Just one little piece to this. We've changed the view. We've updated the model. But now our user does something really inconvenient, and they refresh the page. So we haven't quite done enough. We got to go update the view, because the view needs to know about the fact that, hey, the model has this other attribute, and you need to care about that. So what do we have to change now? Where are we going to go spend some time? Where have we spent a lot of time already? The view. We come back to that view. We're going to have to add a new function. I'm sorry, we're going to have to modify the render. All right, because at this point, render doesn't know about the fact that my model has a priority attribute that I have just adjusted. And again, of course, I'd expect that my server is going to give me this data too in some JSON format. So we come in, we say, okay, I would like to add a class based on the model's priority. Now again, I have a bit of a binding here in the fact that I'm expecting that the priority type matches the CSS I wrote. Right? I'm not saying this is the way you would want to do this in production. It's a pedantic example. Right? But you get the idea of where these things live and what each layer is responsible for. That sounds an awful lot like what we've been doing now on the server for a very long time. Layering is a good thing. I don't think anyone's going to argue about that. Although I did actually once get in an argument with a developer. I said, you know what I don't like about Java? Code's all over the place. I just want to go into one file and edit it there. That'd be a really big file. Yeah, but at least I'd know where it is. Okay, I guess that's one concern. So, all right, that's part of it. Now, there's a few other things we didn't really touch on. One of those is router. For most of us, this is essentially the controller piece of the equation. All right, router is where we get into things like linkability, bookmarkability, things like that. And by the way, you'll notice most of these applications do really nice, friendly URLs, as opposed to the gobbledygook you will see out of certain other things that shall go unnamed in this room. At least I turn the recording on. Backbone router is here to help you. All right, so what Backbone router allows you to do, and again, they all have the same concept, all the MVC libraries, it allows you to basically say this hash of URL equals this state. So go ahead and when you see this URL fragment, I want you to go call this endpoint with this set of data. Now, there's a history API there as well, so that can handle the various things about going backwards and forwards. It will go ahead and step in on the off chance that your browser doesn't implement every piece of the HTML5 spec in terms of the history API. Excuse me. And again, this is really shocking. Its job is to say, oh, okay, you gave me this route. I'm going to go get that data from the server now. I know how to translate, account/123 to mean go get the account whose ID is 123. Rinse, repeat. All right, not too shocking there. So it has a relatively small API in terms of routes and navigate. That works with backbone.history, which, again, shouldn't be too shocking in what it's responsible for. There's a lot of least surprise concepts baked in here, and this is something I really appreciate. I saw a tweet this morning, and I couldn't quite tell if it was a quote from Ward Cunningham or not, but he basically said, you should understand the gist of something, just basically as soon as you see it. And if you got to, work hard to figure that out, you failed. Write it again, right? I've always believed in that method, like a method. If you can't fit a method on a page, especially in Java, you've done something wrong. I would argue anything in double digits where the lines, boy, we're probably stretching it. Now, you're going to have a few that maybe exceed that, but by and large, should be pretty damn tiny. So save location, guess what that does? Saves your location. Shocking. Backbone.sync. So the example I showed you, we were saving it locally, and that's probably not super useful for most of us. We're going to want to talk to the server. Sync will take care of that for us. So the model gets updated. We got to get that up to the server. No problem. Backbone can step in there and say, okay, I'm going to go tell your server what happened. And it's going to do that with what? A RESTful call. And it is expecting a JSON request response. You don't have to do it that way, but that's what makes life easier. And by the way, I think that's the way things should be done on the client these days. So, all right, so what does it get? It gets the method. So what am I calling? Get, put, post, delete. It gets the model. Here's the model I want you to update, and then whatever callback options you would like to bake into that as well, if you wish. So if that call succeeds, the server is happy. Awesome. Life is good. Now, this particular one is based on jQuery, so it gives you that same sort of interface if you're familiar with the jQuery AJAX wrapper. It does not depend on jQuery, right? But they chose to use that API, right, in terms of how they wrote it. So method, that's going to be the CRUD concept here. So not too surprisingly, that's going to map to the verb you want to call on your server. I don't think that's controversial these days. And it has those Rails-based expectations in terms of endpoints. And you can configure it other ways if you wish, but go along is simpler. Model, not too surprising, that's going to be the thing that you just updated. So server, please take note of the fact that I changed the address on this particular account. Options, whatever interesting AJAX callbacks you want. Now, the expectation is that your server is going to respond with, hey, here's some new JSON. I updated the model, here's the model back in JSON format. Maybe it's got a new ID, maybe it's got, counters updated, whatever, but here it is. And of course, it is going to do that synchronously. I'm not sure if you can override that. I'm not sure if you can make that a synchronous call. I have not looked at that. I suspect you probably can if you want to. Although you may ask yourself, why would I want to do that if I'm trying to build this kind of application? So you can call any of the AJAX callbacks. So, if you care about when there's something in error, there's a handful in the jQuery API in terms of success, failure, and I think there's different variants on the failure too, if memory serves. Now, you don't have to use that. You can use local storage if you want. There's an API for that. There's a layer over that, I should say. You can also use WebSockets. By the way, that's the way we'd really like to do it. In a perfect world, we would just have a WebSocket connection back and forth. Because as fast as AJAX can be, you still pay a price. Because every time you got to do that connection, there's a cost to it. And I know it's not a huge cost, but if we're really trying to make performant applications, especially if we're trying to do anything in real time, WebSockets is the answer there. There is a local storage adapter. That shouldn't be too surprising. Server side, again, I've beaten this horse to death. It has expectations of RESTful endpoints. So it is expecting that you have a way of posting a collection, getting a specific element out of the collection, updating a specific element in the collection, deleting a specific element in the collection. Rinse, repeat. Replace that with something from your world and a meaningful ID. Now, Backbone knows how to serialize. It's got that nifty to JSON. And again, we are expecting the endpoints return JSON. Now, most skeptical developers will ask, well, that's all neat, but who's using this? Because if nobody's using it, I don't know if I want to go there. Well, a lot of people, believe it or not, are playing with this. And I keep hearing various companies in our neck of the woods are playing with this stuff. Right? In fact, one's not too far from here. Right? But if you go out in the big bad world, there's a pretty decent chance you are running into applications already that are using this. Right? LinkedIn's mobile is based on this. Foursquare, Khan Academy does a bunch of stuff with these concepts. Groupon is leveraging this. Basecamp Mobile, Pandora, Code School, SeatGeek, Kicksend, Trello. A lot of folks have played with Trello, at least for fun. That's one of Fog Creek's offerings. Right? And that list grows every day. Now, one of the things that I think is incumbent upon us, one of our responsibilities, be aware of the fact that some of our competitors are probably playing with this too. And here's one of the things that I've learned as I've gotten older. Your competitors are never going to tell you why they're beating you. They have no incentive to do that. Right? Now, I'm not saying this is the answer to every problem you've had in IT. All right? I'm not saying you should all rush out tomorrow and build a backbone application. I mean, that'd be cool. I got no problem with that. But understand, this is something you need to be aware of. This is one of those things that's starting to come in our world. Now, you got to go into this with your eyes open. There are landmines here. This is not perfect for every situation, every application, everything you're going to run into. But there's a lot of really useful spots for this in modern applications. I said it before, I'll say it again. You guys are going to write your JavaScript. I'm sorry. Okay? Accept it. It's just the way it is. Now, again, you're going to need to rethink how your application works. You're going to need to think about what these endpoints look like. You're going to need to build things in terms of services. Services that don't care how the data is displayed. I've got one friend right now, he's making the statement that the era of servers being anything more than, or that at this point, servers are just going to be JSON pumps. That's their job. You ask for some, I need this, here you go, here is a JSON. Rinse, repeat. Now, having seen this pendulum already swing a few times in my short career, I'm hard-pressed to say that this is the last paradigm ever. I guarantee we're going to push it back the other way just because. We got to do something new. Somebody will discover Lambdas. You probably can't just take your existing application and port it over because there's so much rethinking in terms of services. I know a lot of the services that have been built, at least in most companies today, way too tightly bound. A lot of people just think, that like SOA and all this stuff is just magic fairy dust, and we get all this reusability. See, if I draw a square on a board and put like SBB or ABB in it, it's a building block now. Yay! Like, it doesn't work that way. You got to design the service to be reused. This is hard. A lot of folks are like, well, no, this is what I need, so I'm just going to give you what you... No, you got to decouple. It's challenging. And it's a different way of building applications. There's no getting around that. For some folks, this is like, ugh, I don't even want to touch that. But guys, these concepts aren't new. These are concepts we have used already for a long time. It's taking the style of application we have been building and turning the knobs to 11. And I know that's a little scary. Now, bear in mind, most of these are fractions. These are not 1.0 type things. These are not Gartner Magic Quadrant yet. And I know, I think it was the latest technology radar, they actually backbone up a bit in their circles and ThoughtWorks, because they were playing with it a little bit and like, ooh, I don't like this particular pattern. I can't remember the specifics on what emerged, but I know they at least kind of have slowed down a little bit on its adoption. That's not to say other people are stopping their usage of it. But this is something to keep in mind. For some companies, it's like, well, if it's not 3.0 and it hasn't been on the cover of CIO magazine, we don't want to touch it. I mean, there's other companies where it's like, oh my God, it went 1.0, we need to get off it. So you're probably somewhere in between. This is a heavily evolving space. I know I've been making a joke out of it, but by the end of the week, there'll probably be a new entrant in the JavaScript MVC world. It's the nature of the beast. Again, that will contract at some point in the near future. But these JavaScript web applications, they are clearly the next step here for a lot of the stuff we're going to build. There is one book on the topic, O'Reilly the Owl book. This is Alex McCaw. This is actually, I think, a pretty good introduction to these concepts. I know you'll see some reviews say, "Oh my God, if you didn't write jQuery the library, you can't understand it. This is designed for libraries." I don't agree with that. I think this is very approachable. Even for folks who are like, "Wow, JavaScript, that's like Java, right?" That might not feel real good to read that book. But for most people that are experienced with JavaScript, this is going to be very approachable in my mind. Now, again, my goal here, guys, is to get you guys to start thinking about it. Where might this fit in your world? Where wouldn't this fit? Right, that's another part of this equation. No tool is a golden hammer, although a lot of things start looking like nails when you get a new one. Right, so just start thinking where this might fit. And guys, it isn't that hard. In less than 90 minutes, we talked through pretty much all of it. That's about all. In fact, I'm going to make my grad students write an app in this in a few weeks. The funny thing about being a teacher, I get to make them teach. Again, from my standpoint, guys, the important thing for us is to understand there's a lot of alternatives in this space. We owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our customers to understand what's going on here, where does this fit, where doesn't it fit, what shouldn't we be using them for. And again, it is early, so for a lot of us that might be a little uncomfortable, but that is the nature of this beast. Whew. Questions, comments, theories?
I'm going to jump in just because I'm such a lover of JavaScript.
Oh, I love JavaScript too.
You mentioned the Clojure script.
Clojure script, yeah.
And I've been doing things with GWT. Is there any?
I'm sorry.
Is there any decent thing out there that emits JavaScript so I don't have to write it?
Is there any decent thing that emits JavaScript? So I'll give you my snide comment about GWT. GWT doesn't emit JavaScript, it excretes it.
Yeah.
No argument. Subtle difference.
No argument.
They're probably, CoffeeScript to a certain extent, that's what it's doing, right?
Okay.
It's kicking out JavaScript out of, it's an alternative syntax. Some people would call it JavaScript.next. I did talk to Crockford about that. I ran into him at a conference last year, and I asked him kind of his thoughts, and he was much more positive on CoffeeScript than I thought he would be. And we are starting to see some of those concepts find their way into JavaScript. There will be some kind of replacement for function. That word is just too damn long, and we use it too hard. So you're going to see something, I think, because in CoffeeScript is like dash arrow, and I think ECMAScript's going to use like equal arrow or something like that just to be a little different. But we're going to get some shorthand for that, and I think other ideas as well. Obviously, ClojureScript, is a compiler that takes Clojure and emits JavaScript out the back end.
Next door neighbor here just mentioned something called Dart. Have you ever heard of it?
Yeah, Dart. That's the Google one, right?
The Google one.
Yeah. Dart feels a little too much like I'm trying to control everything, and at least the initial bits I've seen on it, it seems awfully complicated to do Hello World. That never speaks well. Although Hello World in Java, anyone?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
point.
Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Where do you see user authentication and security fitting into this?
Oh boy, where do I see security fitting in? I have to admit that security is not one of my areas of expertise. I asked Brian Sletton about this at one point because I'm like, hey, one of the complaints I hear is we have to do WS Death Star because we need authentication authorization. You already got that in the web, right? You've already got ways of doing that right now in the browser. So you don't need a new way of doing that. Now we can argue about whether it's a good or a bad way.
But just the notion that all we do is put the authentication or put the security in JavaScript, encrypt it. It's just like,
ooh, yeah.
Never worked.
No, so inherently JavaScript is not a secure language. JavaScript cannot be, I should say cannot be. We can't fix the security problems in JavaScript without breaking the entirety of the web as we know it. And if you guys, this is one of my pet peeves. What does deprecated mean in Java? Don't worry, we'll never remove it ever, right? Because we're so worried about, I shouldn't say we, Oracle now, then Sun, was so worried about some applet somebody wrote in 1998 still working today. Now, you think about both sides of this, because Microsoft loves to break stuff. That's, for better or worse, that is one of the things Microsoft will do. They rev something, they'll break it. Rails will do the same thing. They go from 2 to 3, and guess what? They're going to break stuff, and they're going to tell you that. JavaScript, though, I mean, just think about it. You think COBOL is widely distributed? You think there's a lot of COBOL in the world? There's not even a candle next to JavaScript, right? So if you did something to JavaScript that broke JavaScript, good luck. I don't see how we can. The barn door is open. The horse is already 5 states over. Don't even bother trying to shut the door there. But it is certainly something to be aware of. Do you want to put, hey, here's all the customer data. It's in the browser. Oh, no. Please do not put Social Security numbers and credit card numbers, just because the browser now has a user cookie.
For user roles, a contractor tells me, it's a better user experience if you don't check that against the server. Yeah, but you can't code that way.
I agree. I mean, you have to understand that there's trade-offs. There's no getting around that aspect of it. So, is there one hand? Yes, sir.
Yeah, where do you kind of see these JavaScript web apps? I mean, it seemed like a lot of those samples at the end were mobile stuff. Is it really mobile, lightweight? I mean, how enterprise even application would you go with something like that?
So where would this fit in sort of the enterprise? Is that kind of what you mean, or where is this used beyond like a mobile app?
Like how big of an application would you feel
Sure.
safe using this on, or is it really mainly mobile and tablet kind of thing?
How big should it be? Certainly the drivers right now tend to be very focused on the mobile space just because it is so much smaller and lighter weight, and it does fit that need very nicely. And the mobile browsers, because it's all pretty much mobile WebKit, so much easier for us to deal with. Did you want to chime in on that? Or?
I was just going to give an example of something I'm working with.
Yeah.
It's a web application running for laptops, things like that. It's a Jira. It's a ticketing system.
Oh, ticketing system. Sure. Sure.
Issue tracking system.
Sure.
And they're going full scale. I mean, they use Backbone on this thing.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's cool.
Live updating, so instead of having, every time you change some attribute on something, it has to redraw, right?
Right.
In fact, you change it right in line.
I'd love it if Rally would start adopting some of that. I spend a lot of time waiting for Rally. Well, I shouldn't say I spend a lot of time. I spend a lot of time watching other people update Rally. So the beauty.
They've got actually kind of like Google has, where they've got a query language you can use to find tickets.
Sure.
And you start typing it, and they're starting to say, I think I've got this list here. Is there ability?
Right, so it responds as you start typing in a filter criteria. It'll start eliminating down that list.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very cool. So, to be honest with you, I think part of why you're seeing it so much in the mobile space right now is because it's a very hot area and it's an easier place to do new things. Because we don't have sort of these established entrenched interests. And I think it's an easier sell to say, well, no, we want the server to be just JSON and just, services, and the client will handle more of this. But it feels inevitable that some of that is going to start migrating, into the stuff that we start working with day in and day out. I mean, Gmail uses these concepts. It's not using Backbone that I'm aware of, but similar type of concepts. You bring up your list, your mailbox, behind the scenes, it's grabbing the content for those messages. So you type you tap on a message and you're like, wow, that pops up instantly. It's really quick. No, it's pushed that to you. And notice even within Gmail, if you go to create a filter, that's a new page. I mean, it's going to refresh for that. Within the filter, it's not. But when you go to the filter, it is, because that's in the account page, and there's different things in the account settings. I think that's what they call them. So, other questions, comments?
Anything in Flash is going to be written.
Anything that was in Flash, yes. I think we can all put a fork in Flash at this point. So, I'm actually amazed. I can't remember what it was, but I just ran into something. It was like a survey. Something I had done, like, hey, would you take, a minute to fill out a survey? I'm like, okay, whatever. You need to install Flash. Click. Sorry, I'm not going to fill out your survey if I have to install Flash first. Well, yeah, and especially today where a shockingly large percentage of people's browsing is being done on devices that do not support Flash. I think building something new in Flash today is clearly not the answer. So, should we give away some stuff? So that time of the night?
No?
All right, good. Thank you, guys. Thanks for coming.
Okay. Cool. Nate is going to draw a, slip of paper from the basket.